That shows a lot of dedication. Well, that sounds great. I'd love to see what he becomes.
It is time for us to begin this morning. As we begin, if you'd like to go ahead and open to Genesis 6, we'll be there in just a moment. Chris Livingston asked me to especially to remind everyone that Damon Vincent will be giving his report tonight on his mission work. Just wanted to bring that up to remind everybody to be back here tonight to listen to that report. But as you open to Genesis 6, like I said, we'll be there in just a moment. I remember last week we went through some of the things, evidence that we can see in the world around us of the flood, and that lead credence to that it actually occurred. I just want to read, again, a very familiar text in Hebrews. You don't need to move to come there, but I just want to read it and remind us that it's all really a matter of faith. The creation, the flood, all those different factors we read about, that we have evidence before us that we can see, but what really matters is faith. So here in Hebrews 11:1, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. For by it men of old gained approval. By faith, we understand the worlds were prepared by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things which are visible. The evidence we can behold and see, it's there, like of the flood. We talked last week about the sedimentary layers, the different layers of rock that could only have occurred as a result of the flood. That's really just icing on the cake. The real heart of the substance is our faith. And faith in what God's word says about creation, what God's word says about the flood. And that's where the real heart of the matter is. So as we go through these things, I just wanted to keep that in mind. We're going to look quickly at three different eras of biblical history that are all tied together, and then we're going to come back and look at some more additional information. But here in Genesis chapter 6, I'm going to be using a date of 1,600 years from creation to the flood, and that's just basically based on the genealogies from Adam to Noah. Now, if you look at 10 different commentators with 10 different genealogies, they're going to have basically 10 different dates. They're all going to be relatively close, and so just use this as it's something to relate to of the dates. I'm not saying it's exactly this date, but it's just a reference point. So from creation, from Adam and Eve until Noah, we're covering a period, according to the genealogies, of about 1,600 years. That sin has taken man from a perfect relationship with God, Adam and Eve in the garden. Sin has taken man to that perfect relationship to a point now where man has become so corrupt, God is going to wipe him off the face of the earth. Look in verses, to begin with here, beginning in verse 5, Genesis 6. The Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. And the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, from man to animals to creeping things to birds of the sky, for I'm sorry that I've made them. And then he kind of repeats it again in verse 11. Now the earth was corrupt in the sight of God, and the earth was filled with violence. And God looked on the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way upon the earth. And God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. And behold, I'm about to destroy them with the earth. And then the last one, verse 17. Behold, I, even I, am bringing the flood of water upon the earth to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life. From under heaven, everything that is on the earth shall perish. So from a perfect relationship with God in the garden to now, almost 1,600 years later, an earth that's full of wickedness and evil, corruption and violence, to the point that God said, I've had enough. I'm going to do away with all of them except Noah and his family. Okay, turn on over to Ecclesiastes chapter 1. It's right after Proverbs. Ecclesiastes chapter 1, we've jumped now about 1,500 years since the flood to the time of David, Solomon, Ecclesiastes 1. beginning in verse 3. What advantage does man have in all his work, which he does under the sun? A generation goes, a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. Also the sun rises, the sun sets, and hastening to its place, it rises there again. Blowing toward the south and turning toward the north, the wind continues swirling along. On its circular courses, the wind returns. All the rivers flow into the sea, yet the sea is not full. To the place where the rivers flow, they flow again. The writer here is talking about, in essence, the futility of existence. It just keeps going on and on. Everything goes day in and day out. I thought Burton Kaufman, in his commentary on these particular verses, he laid it out in an interesting way. This is Burton Kaufman's idea on it. The sun goes round and round and never gets anywhere. The wind can't make up its mind where it's going. The rivers work all the time but never accomplish anything. It's the fact of what the writer here in Ecclesiastes is laying out, is that it just, day after day, the sun comes up, the sun goes down, the wind blows everywhere around, the rivers flow to the sea. It is just all one after another. Now in verse 8, he says, all things are wearisome. Man is not able to tell it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor is the ear filled with hearing. And when I use this verse, I just have to make the comment, is this not a prophecy of the internet? The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor is the ear filled with hearing. Nothing's changed, has it? That's just what the writer says. The sun comes up, the sun goes down, the wind blows, the rivers flow, nothing changes. We just can't get enough of seeing and hearing, and we're just in a new realm of that particular idea. So he goes on in verse 9. That which has been is that which will be, and that which has been done is that which will be done. So there's nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which one might say, see, this is new? Already it has existed for ages, which were before us. And verse 11 is kind of the culmination now of this whole idea of what he's laying out here. There is no remembrance of early things, and also of the latter things which will occur. There will be for them no remembrance among those who will come later still. In simple language, as humans, we tend to forget what happened in the past. And even those that come after us are going to forget their past. We look back and we have little remembrance, or we tend to ignore what's happened in the past, or we can. And those that come after us, they're going to do the same thing. They're going to forget their past. So we get involved with life. We get, it just keeps on. Nothing changes. It's just life. And so we get involved in that. Turn over to 2 Peter chapter 3. We're jumping now another 1,000 years. So about 1,600 years to the flood, man had gotten so bad, God wanted to destroy them. The earth was repopulated 1,000 years later in Ecclesiastes. Man still is forgetting the past. And now we jump another 1,000 years, and the same thing is still holding true. 2 Peter chapter 3, beginning in verse 3. Know this first of all, that in the last days mockers will come with their mocking, following after their own lust. We know we're in the last days. The Word tells us that. In Hebrews chapter 1, we're told that God spoke long ago to the prophets, but in these last days, He's spoken to us in His Son. From the ministry of Jesus to His coming, we've been in the last days. There's no special time coming when somebody's going to be able to point, well, Christ must be coming, because look, we've been in the last days ever since Christ came. Paul said in 2 Timothy 3, the last days will be difficult times to come. And he gives a list of all the sins that mankind will be involved in, as is typical with Paul. And then he says, in these last times, men will hold to a form of godliness, but deny its power. In 1 Timothy 4, he said, in the latter times, some will fall away. So we've been in the last times. Since Jesus came, and almost from the very beginning, there were those that fell away. There were those who held to a form of godliness, but denied its power. We are in those last days. So it goes on then in verse 4. And here these mockers mocking, saying, where's the promise of His coming? It's been approximately 35 to 40 years since Jesus' ministry, His preaching, His teaching, the resurrection. So now, here, these 40 years later, these mockers saying, well, you said He's coming back. He said He was coming. Where? We haven't seen Him. Where's He at? And then they go on to say in verse 4, well, if that's not, 40 years He's not come back, for ever since the fathers fell asleep, all continues just as it was from the beginning of creation. Exactly what Ecclesiastes was laying out. Everything's just going along like it always has. Sun comes up, sun goes down, rivers flow to the sea, and they keep flowing. The winds just blow around everywhere. Verse 5, for when they maintain this, it escapes their notice. They've forgotten. Just like Ecclesiastes warned, they've forgotten the past, and those that come after are going to forget. When they maintain this, it escapes their notice that by the word of God, the heavens existed long ago. The earth was formed out of water and by water, through which the world at that time was destroyed, being flooded by water. We forget the past. We forget what's happened. That's why we need to be reminded. And I want to key in on this at the end of verse 5, because that's where we're going to go back here in just a moment. That the earth was formed out of water and by water. And then the world at that time was destroyed, being flooded by water. Water was an element in creation, and it was the element that destroyed the world in Noah's flood. So now, we're going to go back to Genesis chapter 1, and look at some particulars here. First thing I want to point out in Genesis 1, that in the Hebrew, except for verses 1 and verse 27, all of the verses start with the word and. Now the King James, if you're using King James, does include that word and in all the verses. Other versions don't do that. Mine, the New American Standard, doesn't do that. I don't know why they didn't, but they didn't. In it really, I think, it makes an important difference in the way verses 1 and 2 are laid out. In my version, verse 1 is one complete sentence. Begins with, and ends with a period. And then verse 2, they make it a complete sentence. But that word "and" is really, I think, important in this particular situation. And I'm going to read it that way. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. In the beginning, if we just read that as one sentence, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, stop, and then pick up a new sentence, the earth was formless and void. It's a little bit of confusion in my mind anyway of what's actually taking place here. But what he's saying is the heavens and the earth was formless and void. It had no shape. It had no body to it. And darkness was over the surface of the deep. And a lot of people have wondered over the years, commentators have wondered, well, where did darkness come from? If God is light and in him there's no darkness at all, where did it come from? In Isaiah 45, verses 6 and 7, God said, I am the Lord, the one forming light, creating darkness. It was part of God's plan as he dealt with this. And just as an additional point here about the darkness, of course, in verses 3 and 4, God said, let there be light, and God separated the light from the darkness. It's interesting that in the Big Bang Theory that we looked at a few weeks ago, that after what they say was that initial beginning of that smaller than atomic-sized beginning, it expanded. And one of the very first things that they say, according to their teaching about the Big Bang, is that there was light. At that point in the Big Bang, there was no sun and moon or stars, but there was light. As they laid out, didn't expand through all the universe. It took several 100,000 years for that to happen. But I just thought it was interesting that in their concept, they knew there had to be light for everything else to happen. And it just interesting that was something they brought out in the Big Bang. So here he's talking about this, and there's another interesting verse that quotes this, but uses it in an entirely different context. It quotes verses 1 and 2. In Jeremiah chapter 4, Jeremiah is looking at the sin of Judah and the coming invasion that's going to take place because of that sin, that God is dealing with them because of their sin. And so Jeremiah is speaking, and he uses these passages from the opening of Genesis 1. I looked on the earth, and behold, it was formless and void, and to the heavens they had no light. That was the context of Judah's sin as Jeremiah saw it. A nation formless and void, they had no light. So here he opens with this idea here of the earth was formless and void, darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. This key point here now that the waters play in that. Drop down to verse 6. Then God said, let there be an expanse of the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse and separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse, and it was so. And something that I had not come across before, and another thing that Burton Kaufman points out, that in the Hebrew there was no word for gas or vapors. I don't know how you could communicate without, how would you talk about something? Well, that's what he's talking about here. He's talking about the waters, let it separate the waters from the waters below and the waters above. The waters below, liquid water, the waters above, vapor. So that's why it's worded in, we would think of it as such an odd way. Hebrew just didn't have a word for gas or vapor, so that's how he signifies it. The waters below and the waters above. And we know, of course, from Genesis 2 that there was no rain had fallen on the earth prior to the flood, that a mist would rise up from the ground to water everything. And some have pointed out that perhaps, well, obviously God was using that way to water as opposed to rain. But what does rain need in order to occur? It needs dust particles or droplets, something within the atmosphere for the vapor to hold on to get enough to make a raindrop. And so by implication, they're saying, well, there really wasn't anything in that perfect world that God had created in the beginning. No dust in the air, no particulates in the air, a pure air in that regard. But that when the deep broke up, the volcanoes and all that were involved in that, we'll get into a little bit more of that, that has thrown all those particulates in the air that would have precipitated rain. Now, whether you accept that or not, just something interesting to come across that could have helped, that it led up to all that rain. But of course, God, by His word, would have done that as well. And so, like I said, just throw that out there for information. So he has this, here's the water involved in all of this. As he said in verse 2, the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters, and then he divided the waters above and the waters below. Turn on over to Genesis chapter 7 and 8, which covers the flood. If all the water vapor in the atmosphere today in all the world was transformed into rain, it would only amount to a 1 inch over all the earth. So when we think and realize what is occurring in the flood and what God did, then we can get a little bit more understanding of the power and authority of God and what He did in accomplishing bringing all this amount of water on the flood, through the flood. And another interesting thing to note, that in the Hebrew, Noah's flood gets its own word. It's the word Mabul. It means a mighty, not something not ordinary, a mighty deluge. So every time you come across in the Old Testament something referring to, speaking about Noah's flood or the flood in reference to Noah, it's always Mabul. And any other flood that's spoken about, it uses a separate word. In the New Testament, Noah's flood is referred to 5 times. In those, it comes from a Greek word that we get our English word, cataclysm. The flood was something special, something different. It wasn't just an ordinary flood. And we understand it especially when we think of it being a cataclysm, that kind of effect. So here in Genesis chapter 7, verse 11, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on the same day, all the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the floodgates of the sky were open. And the commentators say that the Hebrew language that's used here signifies, as they expressed it, a cosmic catastrophe with violent changes. And so that's kind of what I was trying to make a point of last week, and all the different evidences that are laid out. If those scientists, those geologists will really look at what's there and it shows that the flood did occur, but it was a complete remaking of the earth's surface. As he says, the fountains of the great deep burst open. All that water that was involved in creation is now going to be involved in the flood. And it was more than even just waters being burst open. The evidence of the volcanic eruptions, mountains rising, and we'll touch on that here in just a moment as well, we spoke about last week. We know, of course, we're familiar with the fact that the water rose 15 cubits above the tallest mountain. That's about 22 feet. If all the rain of all the water in the atmosphere rained out today, we'd get 1 inch of water covering the earth. Here we have the highest mountains covered above those highest mountains, 22 feet. In verse 24 of chapter 7, we're told that the waters rose. Of course, it rained 40 days and 40 nights, and the waters prevailed upon the surface of the earth for 150 days, 3 months. No, excuse me, 5 months. I'm thinking of 3. The month was equivalent to 30 days. 5 months, here the water's rising, and the force of that water and what that water was doing to the surface of the earth. Its purpose was to destroy. It destroyed all mankind, and it destroyed the whole surface of the earth. There are some indications in the fossil record that how plant life and how life existed before the flood was entirely different from what it was after the flood. And then in chapter 8, we're told that after the flood, water had rose to that height above the mountains, and it prevailed upon the surface of the earth for 150 days. And you can imagine that constant motion of the water as it moved across the planet. It wasn't just static water just sitting. It was water in motion, water that was changing the surface of the earth. And then it receded for another 150 days. All that water action rising, moving, going up, and now all that water action receding for another 5 months off the face of the earth. And the implication that geologists have studied is that the action of that water receding off the land would have been just as destructive as the water rising up. I used the one illustration last week about in the early 80s, Lake Powell in Arizona, because flood waters had risen so high, they opened one floodgate. And when they did it, within just a few minutes, it washed out 64,000 cubic feet of water just from that one floodgate. So imagine what you've got, the flood of a worldwide flood, what it's doing to the surface of the earth. So as we consider what is laid out in the Word about the flood, in the Old Testament, it has its own special word. It's signifying it was something different, something special about it. And then, of course, in the New Testament, we'll see this as well. Turn over to Matthew chapter 24. We're just going to briefly look at these examples where the flood is referred to. Matthew 24, of course, deals with the coming part of it, the destruction of Jerusalem, and then Christ's second coming. In here in Matthew 24 and verse 3, they asked Jesus a question. He was sitting on the Mount of Olives. The disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" Well, he finally gets around to answering that specific question down in verse 36. "But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven nor the Son, but the Father alone. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like in the days of Noah. For as in those days before the flood," that word cataclysm in the Greek, because it's referencing Noah's flood. "For in those days before the flood, they were eating, drinking, marrying, giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and they did not understand until the flood, the cataclysm, came and took them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be." So not only referencing that the total effect of what the flood was, but using it as an object lesson. We know that it took 120 years for for Noah to build the ark. And in those 20 years, Peter describes him as a preacher of righteousness. And you can almost imagine that when he first started building it, you would think, just natural curiosity, people would come around, "Noah, what are you doing?" And then about 10 or 15, 20 years later, all that crazy Noah, he's still at it. 80 years goes by, 100 years go, if anybody of those people, of course, they lived longer, would still be around, I doubt they even bothered going out and looking anymore. They've just probably gotten so used to, he's still out there building that thing. But then one day, it started raining. Nobody had ever seen rain before. They might have thought, "Wow, this is nice." You'd stand out on a warm day in the rain. But then it kept on raining. And it kept on raining. And the floodgates opened up and the water started rising. And I'm sure there were a lot of those people that it finally dawned on them, he's building a boat. Let us in, They did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be. Do we remember the past? No. We don't. But we should, because we need to remember what happened then as to what is going to happen when Christ comes again. Drop down. So he says in verse 42 here of Matthew 24, Therefore be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming. And then again in 44, for this reason you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming in an hour when you do not think he will. And if you think about, as I said, from the time of Adam until the flood, about 1,600 years, if you go by what's, in the genealogies. And in those 1,600 years, man had become so sinful that God wiped him off the face of the earth. And now it's been 2,000 years since Christ came. And we're really pretty much in the same situation worldwide that they were in prior to the flood. Corruption, sin, violence. The only thing that's different now that they didn't have is the message of Christ coming as the Son of God. Why God is prolonging it, it's God's choice. Till all can, he doesn't want anyone to be lost. But remember, the flood did come, they were lost. Christ is coming again. Will we be ready? So we're going to pick up here next week. Just briefly, let me finish. In Luke chapter 17, Luke repeats this same account that we read here in Matthew 24. And then in 2 Peter chapter 2, I just end with this one, is another use of where the New Testament refers to the flood. 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 5, that he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, the preacher of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. He brought a cataclysm upon the world of the ungodly. And then, of course, the one we already looked at previously in chapter 3, that Noah's flood in the Old Testament got its own word. In the New Testament, when it refers to Noah's flood, it uses that Greek word cataclysm. So we'll pick up here with this idea next week, and we're going to get into the idea of our mighty God as a nation builder. We, of course, know what he did with the nation of Israel. So we'll pick up with that next week. Thank you.